Hello, everyone. You are listening to the Avril Heals podcast. That is not even the name. Hey everyone, you're listening to Avril Heals, the podcast, the official podcast of Avril Heals. I'm your host, Minnie Scarlett, and on this podcast, we talk about culture, mental health, society in a sex positive and hopefully entertaining way. We want to educate and destigmatize our audience's idea of sex workers and a lot of other marginalized communities and taboo concepts. So today we have very special guests on. We have obviously, Jae, our lovely co-founder of Avril Heals, who has co-hosted this with me a few times. And also we have Tatyana Brown, someone that we are so excited of. Even just, we've been trying to do this for a little while is my what I'm trying to say, and we're finally locking it down. So I feel really good. So Tatyana is an African American and Afro Puerto Rican multidisciplinary artist, researcher, and community organizer. There are so many accolades here that are worth mentioning, but I really love to let people kind of do their own introduction a little bit so that you can kind of see how they see themselves and how they would like people to see them, because I don't think it's always about what you're doing for money, how you pay your bills, you know what I mean? So Tati, what do you consider yourself? Is it okay if I call you Tati?
Of course. Tati is. I always say that the names that come from love are okay. Um,
I can call
but
you Tatiana too.
no, Tati's great. Tati or Tatiana, either way. Um, but yeah, I'm super stoked to be here. I'm geeked. I love the work y'all do. And I always find this question difficult because I have like a vision that I work toward, and I consider my career kind of like tools to get there, right? So like my the thing that I aspire towards is like a more liberated and globally connected future, and building systems that are life affirming that can sustain all of that at one time. And the way that I do that is I make art. So I write poetry and do photography and want to get more into like installation art and curating things like that. So it's the cultural organizing. I organize community spaces and organize movements, which is where I've been so lucky to meet with y'all. And I try to do that in as many global contexts as possible to kind of connect movements. Most of that work in the last 5 years has happened in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, um, and increasingly so more recently in Puerto Rico, because we're in a colonial crisis. And yeah, I do research. I research about largely Gen Z. I'm really interested in Gen Z and how we use the internet to politicize ourselves and how that can be a tool to untangle some things that the internet can stretch across oceans and borders in a way that sometimes we physically can't. So I'm interested in that in my research and stuff. So yeah.
I love that you even have these different lenses like Gen Z and also like globalization and stuff like that, and just like having not only a Western lens on things, but also like specifically Gen Z, I think is so interesting because I'm technically, I think, like the very last. I don't know. I'm like literally in a cusp. So I'm like Gen Z, but I'm like millennial, but like you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
there's like that little bit. And I always look at the differences of like what worked for who and everything. And I'm always so in awe of the way Gen Z is like just embodied and like did all these things that were so hard for millennials to do, And so what do you think is kind of like for my ex or my experience, and what I think is that Gen Z is way more down to like label things for what they are, but they're also better at kind of moving forward with that too as a reality, versus like millennials are very like scared to call something racist, but then once it's called racist, it's almost like it's the end of the world and we don't know how to move forward, and like, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like, is that kind of part of um something that you talk about, or like what is the focus when you're talking about that?
This is such a. I just had this like distinction that came out earlier when I was talking to a friend of mine who is 26 ish, upper mid 20s, and we share a lot of like digital experience. Um, So sometimes I don't know if the generation marker really gets the vibe across. Um, I guess what I'm curious about is like people who I think Gen Z falls in a really interesting like um, section because if you came of age at the same time the internet was coming of age, there's like this really prime time, I guess, for like how to explain this. Coming of age at the same time as the internet means that the developmental things that make the internet, we also were like the influencers that create that thing. And so I'm really curious about like our culture, assuming like we have access to the internet and all these things, because a lot of people in the world don't have access to the internet. But I'm really curious about how our culture affects the internet and how the internet connects affects our culture. And I think older generations, like accountability looks different with older generations than with Gen Z. I'm not saying that Gen Z can't struggle with accountability because that is definitely a thing. Um, but I find it interesting how much there's a priority of like being critical. Like everyone wants to have a take, which can have its pros and cons. But when you want to have a take on so many things, like there are things that collectively the internet generation has like ditched, right? Like we've, for example, like I remember when intersectional feminism was like coming to be on the internet in like 20 what 16 whatever, they were like, at least I think, like, like that was becoming more of a conversation. And then eventually it was, we were able to just, like talk more critically about like white women or how we feel about a certain thing. And so as a generation online, there's certain perspectives that we just like assume, right? Like we're on a hot girl agenda, hottie agenda, whatever. And that means that we don't like center men in the middle of our lives. Um, and so there are like these things that we've come to accept and critiques that we form around that forms through a culture online and then manifests in real life. And I think the Gen Z or whoever is like digitally native tends to catch on to those critiques a lot faster. And sometimes millennials can be in that space, but also I think sometimes because I don't think it always translates the same way, depending on
Can
when you
can
came
we make it
online.
clear really fast, like who is Gen Z and who is a millennial for like people who don't know? I know, and I know like where I kind of fall in the spectrum or whatever, but like a lot of people don't know and like call millennials like there's some people who are like, oh yeah, millennials, and they're talking about Gen Z or like vice versa and stuff. So,
Yeah.
like, I know there's like a year cutoff and stuff like that. Like, what is your definition of it?
The definition that I followed in my thesis was I think Pew Research Institute says that the Gen Z cutoff is 97. Um, I want to say the beginning of 1997. And so that would be, and this is like contested, but my understanding is that that's the line, so to speak. Um, yeah, which is really not that long ago, now that I think about it.
Yeah, I'm definitely a millennial, but I also knew that I was part of Generation Y. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think when I was like a kid, I wrote a song called like Generation Wine or something like that, just like reflecting on it or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, so every time it's actually funny because now that I work with like Jay and like some of the other coworkers are like a little bit younger than me, every time I see like a millennial TikTok, I'm like, is this how you guys see me? Like, you know?
Yeah.
But I always think it's interesting because there's certain things that I feel like Gen Z really nails. You know what I mean? But like
Mm.
again, there's all these different things. Like they're not going out as much, they're not having sex as much, um they're not doing drugs as much, you know? And that's kind of interesting too. So like what do you feel like there are pros and cons. Like, what are your thoughts on the cons a little bit and what like Gen Z has really like kind of solidified?
Yeah, there are a lot of pros and cons, like a lot. um, I think there tends to be this sort of like collective crisis management that is happening online. Like I think a lot of times the politic I see online is very much informed by the like we're quite young and we're very aware of like being alive in late stage capitalism, right? Like we can name it and call it that. Um, and so people will bring their crises to the internet and talk about like having children, for example. I think that's a really, really big point of discourse that um, has been out and about, right? Like knowing that we're in late stage capitalism and like fast furniture and fast fashion and everything. You know, if you like were to ever buy a house, it'll fall apart in 20 years. And we know that we are in a moment in time when like the future is shaky. Climate change, all these things. It's a little pending revolution. The future is shaky. And so I find it interesting the critiques that come from that. Um, because they can be fruitful for how to live your day in the present, what things that you give energy to, what things you give time to, and what things you can just kind of avoid. But I think the downside can also be that it can get a little doomy. Um, like it can be difficult to exit, I think, from, or just take pause from the reality of like, shit's a little rough. And it can be hard to like see outside of that. Um, I do think there's like a counter culture to this, which is like the touch grass concept. You know what I mean? Like romanticizing your life and touching grass and getting out and doing things and da da da. Um, which has a lot of utility, I guess, in like pushing against the doom and gloom. But I also think the doom and gloom can come from I see that coming from millennials too. Doom and gloom without like a deeper critique or a solution. I do think Gen Z can be quite solution oriented in a lot of things. Um, and so it's a give and take. Oh no, lost connection to the server. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, I think it just reconnected.
Okay,
That's super weird. Can you hear me though? Okay.
I can hear you. It's a little in and out,
Okay.
but generally I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. So obviously you are part of Gen Z, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which
Right.
is super impressive because you have traveled what, like 20 countries? I
No.
have questions also about that. Like where, like what kind of brought you into that? Because I know that you said you're an artist, but you're also, an activist and you're doing specific work. What age did that kind of like happen for you, and what made you, like, what pulled you to that?
Yeah, this is a recent thing. Very recent. So I took my first international flight. My first international flight was the flight to move to a new country. Um, and so I was not very much like, yeah, I didn't have international experience like that. I always like to clarify that like I grew up in South Texas, close to the border with Mexico. I grew up between South Texas and Puerto Rico. We're a colony, a U.S. territory or whatever, so it's not considered a like international, you know. But I grew up
Wait, can you
international.
repeat that one more time? I'm so sorry. I didn't hear it.
No, I was saying I grew up in South Texas by the border with Mexico, and between there and Puerto Rico. So like it there was always this like international underbelly being in a community of people that are primarily not from the whatever we want to call the border of the United States. Um, so being in those spaces, I always felt like I had international access without necessarily an international footprint. Um, so I always say that the beginning of this whole international thing actually started quite young. But my first international flight was to go and visit Abu Dhabi for a weekend before I decided to move there for college, and that's kind of where it all began. Um, so I've just been on this like this nonstop rotation of mostly for my academic program, but
And did you when you visited, was it for just to visit the school?
yeah, I visited. I went there to visit. So NYU Abu Dhabi has like a candidate weekend is what they call it. So you go for 2 days, and it's basically to help people like perceive that they're not going into this like fantasy world. That it's a real place with real people that does real things. And so I went there for that reason, and it was extremely important because I don't think I would have had it in me to just like take the offer and move there without visiting first. So that was my first international flight. I was 18. That was in March of 2018. And then it just like cascaded from there.
So how is that being like the first international flight you take? Because I feel like a lot of people, like, they'll go to like Mexico, or they'll go to Canada, or they'll go, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
um did you have any previous connection with that culture, or like was there something that drew you there specifically? I know it was like the NYU campus, like the program, but like what were you feeling? Because I know a lot of people have like
Mm.
so many ideas and stuff about that part of life. You're literally right next to like Saudi Arabia, you know, you're also next to like Qatar, and so what, you know what I mean? Like how were you
Yeah,
feeling about that?
you know, I didn't have any previous connection with the Arab world, really. I mean, I have my dad bought tint from a Palestinian family. I didn't know where Palestine was when I was a kid. I just knew that they were Palestinians, and they spoke Spanish because they lived in Texas. They spoke Spanish, English, and Arabic, and like Mexican Spanish. I thought was really funny, um, and I just thought they were cool. And but that I didn't have growing up in San Antonio. I didn't have Arab community. And so going to Abu Dhabi was 100% like a sharp right, where it was just like it entered into my life because a recruiter came and talked to me for 4 years, trying to convince me to consider going to the program. And it took me like every year I considered it a little bit more. And my parents initially were like, "What in the hell? Like, why would this even be on your radar?" You know what I'm saying? Like, go to UT like everybody else, and like like not like everybody else, but like stay in the country. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
most people don't leave the country for college. Like just go to University of Texas. It's a great program, or go to NYU in New York. Um,
Is it a popular program or like that they have over there? Like what's this you know, the specialty, I guess, the focus of what's going on over there as far as like their campus?
so when I moved there, it was 10, no, it was 6 years old. I graduated in the 10th year. So it was a new program, very much a new thing. I mean, NYU has been existing for a long time, but the international campuses are relatively new. Um, the focus, there are quite a few departments. I was in the social research and public policy department, so social sciences. They have a really dope like arts center and arts department. I actually started off as a film major, and then I switched to policy, which I don't know if I regret that or not. Here we are. But um, yeah, I wanted, what makes the school unique is it's an international curriculum. So you are constantly, every 3 months, you're moving somewhere new. You do 2 years. I ended up doing 2.5 years in Abu Dhabi total, cumulatively. And then I'd spent a semester. I met Jay. We did a semester together in Madrid, in Spain. I did a semester in New York. I did a semester in Ecuador. I did a January term in Florence. So just like there's a lot of bouncing around, and what ended up happening, this whole like long list of countries. The real reason I ended up traveling is because I couldn't go home. I had like 2 weeks out of the year to they would fly us back to wherever our home base was. So I would go home for like winter break and summer, but during like fall break or spring break, I mean, I can't go back, take a 17-hour flight for a 5-day trip. You know what I mean? I also didn't have the money to do that. So I would just go home with my friends during breaks. And that was a major eye opener for me because I was able to see their plights and their lives without the like weird fantasy thing that American tourism does to countries. Um, but to go home and stay with somebody's family and see their real lives, their recipes, their struggles, their this, that, and whatever. That ultimately was what informed my politic and my interest in global solidarity in the first place. Um, and that's, I think, the best gift from the last 4 years is that.
Do you notice that that kind of international experience has given you like a different perspective, like when you come back to the States and talk to other people who are like in the movement or have like social ideas and stuff? Like how do you feel like that kind of affected your perspective and how you kind of do things?
Oh man, it's changed everything. Like I had an experience recently. This would happen in waves, but I'll give this like anecdote. I went to a fantastic conference, Socialism 2022, in Chicago, in September, and I had just graduated. So I graduated in June. I worked in DC for the summer, and then I went back to PR, and I came to Chicago for this conference. Um, and it was so fascinating to me to be in like leftist spaces in a global sense, but then to come back to a conference that was kind of like American centric, even though that wasn't. They put a lot of effort into not making it American centric. I want to make that very clear. Um, But what was interesting to me is the way that the conference was categorized. They had like topics that they put the different like panels into, and there was one that was like the international topic, the international panel, and I had this inkling that this just doesn't feel right, right? The internationalism is not it's a topic. It internationalism is not a topic; it's a scope, right? It's a framework.
The whole picture almost, you know?
Yeah, like there's more to when internationalism is built into the way that you organize your politic and your movement. It's not something that where you can. It's not fair to talk about American movements and then like add a like small panel about Brazil. We talk about all of these things in fluidity, and we talk about all of our relationships to it together. And that brought up a lot of questions for me because I have struggled. One of the biggest things I've struggled with, both with myself in advancing my politic and also in being abroad for so long and then coming back into American leftist movements, is that being based in the West, and particularly in the United States, requires us to deeply interrogate American exceptionalism, but also to realize that Americanness, period, gives our platforms a lot more weight. Um, and so there's this thing that can happen where we can afford to assume that the world knows about Black Lives Matter and about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Stonewall and all these things because it's set as like this blueprint. But one of the reasons it can be said as that in the first place is because American cultural hegemony exists, right? I can confirm the world does know what these things are, right? Everybody at Pride, Black Pride in Amsterdam knows what Stonewall is, right? Um, but what I question is why not the reciprocal? And so there's this thing that has to happen, which is like we have a lot of studying to do, and I think deep and fundamental to our politic, we have to interrogate the like implicit like parentheses United States that like creates our scope in leftist movements. And I think that's happening. Leftist movements historically have been incredibly international. I just think it's important that it's not an afterthought or like a side piece. It has to be the center.
Absolutely. Especially when we're talking about things that are like affecting us, but it's just like literally like that tip of the iceberg. You know what I mean? It's almost like there's all this other story underneath that we just ignore. And like something I did want to talk about was basically just, I mean, there's so much I want to ask you honestly about like your time overseas and like things that you've learned and, you know, just advice that you might have gotten and stuff. But also like while I have you and Jay here, I know like you both are Puerto Rican and stuff. So I just like, I wanted to talk about just sovereignty in general, because I think a lot of people, they understand a little bit, but they're not versed in the whole like history, because even if you know what's going on right now, it's like it's not as meaningful as when you kind of know the entire backstory too, you know, because then it just seems like, oh, this one shitty thing we did, and it's like actually the entire context is shitty, you know? So like I think it's super, super important for people to kind of be educated in that. And like obviously like I can say my perspective and stuff, but I would love to just kind of hear your both of your thoughts on kind of and maybe like a quick rundown too for people who just aren't, you know, tapped into it. And I talk to Jay about it a lot, and like, you know, like an example I always use is like 9/11. We're so here, everybody knows what 9/11 is, and we're all like never forget, and like they're jealous of our freedom and stuff. I'm like, but what happened to their freedom? Why are they jealous? Like, did we take their freedom? Like, let's talk about that, you know? And then no one knows anything about any of those conflicts that have been going on for basically thousands of years that kind of like, you know, contributes to that. So getting a little more specific, Puerto Rico and sovereignty. So I think a lot of people don't understand what is Puerto Rico to us right now, as far as a like what is the United States doing to Puerto Rico? How long has that been going on? Why is that a problem? I know, but you know, I know a lot of people don't, and I don't know everything. So I would love to hear just like your thoughts on that, and kind of even just, you know, to explain to people who don't.
Word. Jay, you want to tell the folks?
I can start with some of the overall history, and then if you want to fill in anywhere, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about today. I know you've also been there a little bit more recently than I have, but just going over like general history. The island of Puerto Rico was originally named Borican, which was its Taino name, which is actually even Arawak, and even the name Taino comes from the language that the Arawaks had been speaking. And this is, a story, but also rooted in a lot of like tradition and history. But essentially, when Colon, who was Christopher Columbus, came from Spain to the island, one of the first words that the Arawak said to him and his people was Taino, which meant peace. So he didn't know what that meant. And they were just trying to say, like, peace, like, we want to be in peace with you. And that's where that name originated from. There's a couple books I can send to, like, substantiate all of this. But essentially, that's kind of like where all of this started. Coulon came. They ended up enslaving the majority of the people who were on the island. They used them for labor. Once most of them had been murdered off, they ended up stealing people from West Africa and also enslaving them. So that today like leads to a lot of the like cultural like mixing and racial mixing that happens on the island, where like some Puerto Ricans have like blonde hair and blue eyes. So it's like, who do you think their descendants are? And then there are other people who are like different backgrounds. So it speaks a lot to like how we understand in regards to race, ethnicity, and like the history of it. But then over time, there was the Spanish American War. So then America ended up getting like ownership over Puerto Rico. Right now, I think it's a colony and it's in colonized status, but it's known as a territory. So that comes with a lot of like legal things attached to it, which means that Puerto Ricans who live on the island don't actually have access to voting in American elections, even though they're deeply affected by the elections that happen in the US. And there's a lot of other stuff with like impositions and stuff that has to do with how they're able to trade and who they're able to trade with. And most of the stuff has to come from like US boats and other things like that. So it's quite complicated and complex.
Mm.
But I think those are like some of the general key points of the history. And one thing that I also always love to illuminate is that the people on the island of PR have always been trying to fight back in all of these different moments of history that have happened. When Spain was there, now that America's there, people to this day are still fighting for liberation. There have been a lot of different movements that have happened throughout time, and there was actually a period in time where the U.S. actually bombed Puerto Rico during one of the independence movements in the town of Jayuya, which is what I think is so interesting about how we talk about 9/11, but we also don't talk about all the things that the U.S. has done in history. So they sent bomber planes, and yeah, lots of stories and rich history there. There's also movements that happened in the US that were trying to fight for liberation. There were the Young Lords, who were based mostly in like New York, and I think one other state that I'm missing right now, where they started. But basically, people have been fighting the whole time. And yeah, I think I'll go there. Tati, please fill in, add anything else.
That was the most comprehensive, like, bullet
I was
point.
just thinking that. I was like, that was really
Literally.
like good. All the like strong points kind of in a palatable way to understand.
100%. Like it's giving John Green, those like high school history videos where he's like, "Bah, bah, 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 bah." Amazing. So my singular contributions are more in the contemporary, and what's been going on more recently. So Puerto Rico is in a crisis in the sense of because we have very limited electoral power over ourselves. We're in this question of sovereignty, self sovereignty. And I also like to make this comparison with other countries in the world, right? So, like, Hong Kong is in a similar situation to us, Taiwan is in a similar situation to us, Papua New Guinea under Indonesia is in a similar situation to us. Palestinians have a similar plight to us, and it's different in a sense,
Free
obviously,
Palestine.
and every day of the week, period. And so I like to contextualize that our plight is not necessarily that unique. There are a lot of people in the present moment who are struggling this way and in different stages, right? Hawaii is in a similar situation to us. Um, and so that gives us things to look at when we think about what comes next. I
So
what concerns me now in the present is we have this since Maria, there has been a mass privatization of the island. So there's a shift in policies that allow for example, like incentivizing Americans to move into PR, while not creating a lot of incentives for Puerto Ricans to stay in PR. So obviously, we know that Hurricane Maria like thousands of people died after the hurricane, but also the structural damage to the island has been one of the most important like instances of neglect, I would argue, since like Hurricane Katrina or anything like this. Like it's a very major structural neglect that ultimately falls under the jurisdiction of like the Department of Transportation, Department of the Interior. Technically, if we're putting it under like a governmental umbrella, we haven't received those resources. We have been fundamentally struggling because people don't have power, right? These very basic things. And obviously we're a resilient people and people have found ways, but there's only so much that you can do when the basic public goods that are supposed to be provided to you, so long as you're a taxpayer, they're not there in the way that they should be. So a lot of people have left. We've had a massive kind of exodus since 2017, September of 2017, from the island. And this has created this big imbalance in having a workforce, but also the island feels emptier. That was that was what my art was about when I was there, is documenting houses that have been overgrown with vines. Also documenting old people who I like worry will soon pass on because that's the nature of life. Um, and so and then also college students, right? College students, if they don't go to UP, University of Puerto Rico, they'll go somewhere in the US and then they kind of begin that like diasporic trajectory. I'm someone who's in the diaspora. I understand. I'm not here to be like anti-diaspora. I'm here because I'm concerned about what gets left behind, and about our relationship with the island and how much we can afford to keep it against these forces that shouldn't have it in the first place. Um, Most recently with like these I'm sure y'all have heard about like the cryptocurrency, the crypto bros who like come in and buy these massive swaths of land, and also incentives for major hotels and touristic industries to come in and buy large swaths of land. That period, yeah. Jake Paul, TikTokers, like all of these,
Fuck Jake Paul.
literally,
Fuck
like
Jake Paul.
this is the thing that bothers me is, I had this experience of going back to like Dorado, where I would go with my abuela when I was little, and like to see a place that used to be just like a place that we would go to have like a sign that says private property. You know what I mean? What does that even mean? So that's the crisis we're in, where houses are vacating. Americans are being given financial incentives to move into the island. But if you have a Puerto Rican ID card, that those incentives don't transfer to you. So that means the subsidies are available to support Americans to move in, but suddenly they're not available to keep Puerto Ricans on the island. And that's like from a policy perspective, that's the thing that I'm trying to like attack and breach. Um,
Yeah. And the fact that like they're the colony, so they're supposed to be taken care of by the United States as well. You know
right.
what I mean? And I don't know if anybody remembers that terrible, terrible footage of Donald Trump like throwing like I don't know if it was toilet paper or paper towels or something, basically
Right.
being like, we're here, like we're doing stuff. And I'm like, you know what I mean? That was like a very visual like thing of like, you know what I mean? And that wasn't even, I don't think, for this specific
Right.
tragedy. I think it was something else, you know? So, yeah. Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'd
No,
love to
right.
add in there really quickly, speaking on like the U.S. and what it's done to, just adding a little more context. Like even with the Young Lords, which was they originally started out as like a street gang, and then they turned more into like a political organization. They were eventually infiltrated by the CIA, so that they would no longer exist. And it wasn't until they started moving their organizing work to the actual island of Puerto Rico, which is when the CIA infiltrated, and then it
Mhm.
no longer exists to this day. um, so yeah, I think that's a really important part of the history. And I think also when talking about like liberation movements and that international context as well, one thing that I found really interesting about the Young Lords and like a lot of the research that I've done in my honorable moments of being able to speak with some previous members is that when they moved to the actual island of PR, they actually did struggle a little bit with some of the organizing because they still had a very like American lens to the work they were doing, because most of them were like New Yorkers and they had grown up in New York, but their family was from the island.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of things they had to do to mediate those gaps. But it was when they got to the island and they started working on mediating those gaps that the U.S. ended up infiltrating, just like they did with the Black Panthers and many other organizations. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that a lot of Young Lords organizing work and framework came from the Black Panthers as well.
Right.
So did the Crips. If anyone knew that, the Crips literally were right after that. But anyway, so speaking about like the international lens or whatever, it's like the infiltration. I think it's so funny because I'm Vietnamese. So Ho Chi Minh actually infiltrated the CIA, and that's how he got all of that intel. And they were like, he's such a nationalist. We can trust him. He's a good one. He's not a gook like the rest of them, et cetera, et cetera. He took all of that, got the weapons, and look what happened. You know what I mean? So it's like America will really try the fuck out of people. And that is the only reason we were able to get our own country back, you know, was really being able to have that guerrilla warfare and like even fighting against our own people, because a lot of us were like, oh yeah, we're just gonna jump on it, you know. No shade to everybody here because I know it's very complicated, but it's like, yeah, like the sovereignty thing is such a big deal. Like even like I have Hawaiian friends, you know what I mean, who they hate the fact that it is quote unquote a state. You know, it's one of the states of America, and that sucks, because it gets so erased. And because it's a state, now everybody thinks it's like it's quirky the way that we're like yeehaw with like Southern people, that they're like, oh, luau's and stuff. I'm like, no, this is a completely different culture. It's a completely different thing. And then Tati, I did want to get your thoughts on like, even when people are granted sovereignty, you know, and I've seen it in a few different movements where people kind of get what they want, but then they're not sure what to do with it. Like Occupy was a really good example. It could have been so many other things, but then it got infiltrated. There was no organization. Like it was just, you know, whatever. And then same with when Egypt got democracy, they weren't really sure what to do with it, because I don't know if it wasn't that they had never done, like, I'm not gonna, you know, speak on what I think happened or whatever, because I don't really know. But that was a really good example also of like they got democracy and then something just wasn't lining up with what needed to happen. You know what I mean? So as far as like, I know you have so much experience in just seeing different countries, but also I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge of different countries and their histories of gaining independence and kind of breaking away from these kinds of things and stuff. And I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on like Puerto Rico, and if they were granted sovereignty, like what would be like the ideal situation? And maybe that is like a big question to ask, and you can give me a very vague answer, but I am a little curious, because you do have this like international lens that I really, really think is so valuable.
This question is gorgeous and incredibly complicated.
I know, I'm so sorry.
Beautiful question, because I think it's Charlene Carruthers. I did a program with her called the Black Europe Summer School in Amsterdam, and she gave a presentation. She wrote the book Unapologetic: The Black Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements. Fantastic book. Please, please, please read. Please read. Gorgeous for the people. She asked a fantastic question, which was, are you ready to win? Which has like stuck with me forever and ever. Amen. Because the question of, let's say you have these demands and you get them. Now what? Right? Are you prepared for what it actually takes to not just organize against what's stopping you, but organize into what you want to create? And like, I think that is one of the difficulties of being in leftist movements, because we're often kind of taught we're organizing to tear things down. Abolition, for example, has a beautiful framework around this, is that abolition is not just it's not just a negative concept, it's also a positive concept, right? Abolition is in construction, abolition is also in undoing. So anyways, I think that question is hard, and it's been in the back of my mind for a really long time. That's to say, in the case of PR, one pressure that I really, really, really like to highlight is that in the hypothetical situation that we're granted our sovereignty, in the late stage capitalism moment we're in, but also with the imperial power that the US has, I have this very reasonable worry that we are going to end up in a similar situation to Haiti or Cuba. Because the US has a long, 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 long history of using the kind of like economic squeeze and the military, of course, and its interventions in the economic squeeze to create political outcomes that it wants to see come from a certain place. So that pressure is always there, right? In the face of incredibly innovative solutions for public goods, right? Like So many countries have tried, for example, to nationalize their resources. Venezuela nationalizing oil. Chile has tried to nationalize, I believe they tried to nationalize their copper, and so many things. And then that's met with Cuba, of course, nationalizing its own things and asking for a fair price to be paid if people want to go ahead and use any of their materials. That's usually met with intervention, right? Military intervention. So my worry about PR and what we do once we have sovereignty is always clouded by, with sovereignty, I know that we should probably expect intervention. We should probably expect that there will be some other economic force, largely from the United States, I assume, um, that will try to prevent us from having this outcome through another way, through another means. That aside, that's my fear. My enthusiasm is, and this is more coming from the international perspective. I don't. My precursor on this is I don't like. I grapple a lot with the concept of the nation state. Okay. Um, living
I
in the
know
United
it's so complicated. I'm so sorry to even put this.
complicated. It's complicated. It's really hard. Um, it's very difficult to want to imagine a like world without borders and all these things while also needing like a some kind of functional structure for your little part of the world to exist in the larger ecosystem today now. Um, so living in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, for the last four, I guess, going on 5 years. I'm not there now, but anyways, the UAE is 52 years old as of like a week ago. 52 years old. So it's a very new nation state, a new country. And so being there has made me extremely aware of what it takes to make a nation and also what sacrifices happen in creating that nation. I have a lot of concerns about the process of creating a nation state and nationalisms and all these things that really don't serve us. But what I take inspiration from is there is a narrative, there's a cultural element of creating this new project that I find really exciting. And I don't know a time in my lifetime, but also my great grandparents and their great grandparents don't know a time in their lifetime when PR has kind of, as a people, written its own narrative. And I find myself really excited about that. Like I think about how cool it would be to have um, like like electric grids. So there's like this push for having communal solar power systems. So instead of there being one large, like respectfully fucked up electric grid system that spans across the island, creating a more like local scale electric grid where if one breaks down, only one community will suffer, and then they can just pipeline into the next one, right? So PR being a land that is extremely, extremely resourceful, a people that is extremely resourceful. We have so many things. I find it exciting if we had our sovereignty, if we could be the innovators for some of these projects that other countries that are too big or too old or too this or too that can't try or won't try, but we could. My thing is, though, if I put myself at the forefront of doing that kind of thing, my worry is that I would be, you know, because the people who I look up to who have tried that, unfortunately, have faced a lot of like potentially even life-ending risks for doing that kind of thing for their home. So those are my fears. It's a complicated question. It's complicated to find inspiration for nation state building when you don't really believe in nation states. Um, and I turn a lot to my friends in Chile who are like rewriting their constitution, um, while figuring out what constitutionality even means. I turn a lot to like Palestinians who are trying to create physical lived realities in Palestine while also not necessarily having like the legal backing to do that anymore, so on and so forth. So it's like taking these doses of inspiration while also acknowledging that the systems we work in may not exactly be what we want, if that makes sense. That's a long-winded answer, but I tried.
No, that was perfect. Honestly, I was like, as I was asking the question, I was like, "Damn, this is very like a intense question to put on one person." I'm like, "So how do you think we should fix it?" You know, and that wasn't
Beautiful.
exactly what I was asking. But you know what I mean. I just thought like you definitely have some great ideas as far as with just the like I already said, the international and intersectional kind of like view of things is so valuable. And I think that's kind of the thing, is that no one has context. Like, I don't want to say no one, but it's very, very rare to find a general population that has the full context of everything, because even when it comes to like the Palestine Israel thing, it's like thousands and thousands of years old. So depending on who you get your information from, depending on A, B, and C, like you're gonna see all these different things. Like I have a lot of like Palestinian friends. I also worked at a synagogue for like so many years, so I know like different types of Jewish people, and like they all have different beliefs as well and stuff. So I have all these like just like all this knowledge in my head, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I wish other people knew certain things, because it makes it easier to understand these basic things that are kind of like very unknown to, Americans specifically, because we don't pay attention. We don't think anything has to do with anything unless it's right here, right now. Like even Puerto Rico, that's supposed to be part of something that has to do with us, and we're still so ignorant to it. You know what I mean? So that's why I'm like, just really thankful that you both are just even open to saying these, because obviously you don't owe anybody any education, but it does so much at the right times for certain people to have these like palatable like conversations and like information in a way that is something they can hopefully absorb. And I'm sure all of this stuff was very enlightening for you, and like learning all of this stuff was just making you just smarter and smarter. But I also know that being like knowing all this stuff can actually have like such a draining effect on you. So like, how do you kind of balance the educational with the political with the personal, because it does get very personal and kind of draining when you have to do these things, especially because you are an artist as well, so you don't just connect with it on a political level, you know what I mean? It is personal, and I'm sure it's taxing in a lot of ways. How do you kind of balance that, because I'm like, I feel like you've done so many things where you're giving back to the community as well, and it's very, very impressive. But I'm just like, how do you, or do how do you balance that in a way that feels okay?
Oh man, there's
Another question. I'm so sorry.
no, don't apologize, because these are the questions. Like this is like the meat of this like experience of global solidarity, right? Like, and this is the stuff we simply must process. These questions are fantastic. I had an experience the other day. A friend of mine, a dear friend who's Palestinian, his family's in Palestine. He grew up in Palestine, and he went to college with me in Abu Dhabi. He texted me and was like, just random. I really, a lot of my friends, when we text, we don't like say hello. We just get straight to the like, have you ever processed the like, and then, it's like
That's the best thing. Honestly, I feel kind of like an old like person. If I'm like, hey, so and so, da da da, it's blah blah blah. They're like, we know, like.
Yeah, it's exactly like it's the best, because we're always connected. There's no need for a greeting or a departure, which I love. So he texted me and was like talking about how he doesn't really know how to grapple with the hurt, how much to accept that he's a Palestinian and the Palestinian experience is extremely painful, and he knows what he's seeing. His friends, his family talk about these things from the first hand perspective, but he doesn't know where to put his rage, and he doesn't know how to decide what to do in the day to day. What do you do when the sky is falling? I guess is the question for us all. And I read that text. I'm like sitting next to my family. We're in the living room. I'm crocheting my mom's scarf, and I just bust out crying, just bust out in tears. Because it can be, this is not me doing like the white woman thing at all. I'll contextualize. I love my people so dearly, and I love the worlds they come from. And it can be such a heavy thing to have this like deep, deep, deep empathy, right? To like see my friends. I have another close friend who his parents couldn't come to graduation. He's from Ukraine. His parents couldn't come to graduation because the war is like ongoing. They don't have transportation to get out. So my family was his like family for the weekend in Abu Dhabi, and like so there's a very direct line, I guess, so to speak, between like myself, my friends, and the worlds they come from in the movements. It's not headlines; it's a direct line. And so for me, I see that as both like the thing that keeps me connected to movements, and the reason why I wake up and I'm like, I want to do this today and we need to do this today and is because I see these movements as like people in my life who have families and friends, and they're just, the movement is just their families and friends. So that's the upside. It's like it's my fuel. It does everything for me, and it gives me cause. But then the painful side that is difficult to grapple with is it hurts so much deeper. It cuts really, 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 really close because headlines turn into DMs about real people. And the way that I grapple with that lately is I write poetry. Um, and I write poetry specifically about this, like this, what it is to be young in the global South and in colonial crisis, which seems to be a pattern. Let me close up. She got it. Which seems to be a pattern for a lot of us, for very different reasons. And that has given me release, but it hasn't quite scratched the itch. And I don't know what sum of things has to happen to make it easier to process. I also tell my friends I love them as much as possible, like all the time. Like I'd text my friends, "Hi, I love you," and then like whatever the next thing is, because that, I think sometimes it's just like all you can do. So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I definitely feel like I think that's why I get along better also with like other first generation people or people who like came here from somewhere else, you know, depending on their story, because like my parents came here you know, as refugees or whatever, but it's like also very complicated, so it's really nice to talk to people who understand certain nuances as well, because we also have a little diaspora here, and I don't always relate to them all the time because my family is also North, like Vietnamese. It's a mixture, but we were like part of the North Vietnamese that emigrated down to the South so that we could vote for what the North wanted. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was kind of a different reason we came here, but nonetheless, it kind of helps to be around people who, you know what I mean? We're not chatting about it like it's a cool debate or something. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, this is actually like your life. This is actually, you know, and I feel like that's what made me understand things so much, was contextualizing it. Again, I'm so like pro contextualizing things, because that's why no one understands anything. If you ask somebody like what the Middle East is, it's like they get so confused. You're like, yeah, like Afghanistan is in Asia. And they're like, wait, I thought it was in the Middle East. And I'm like, okay, so where is the Middle East? But like, if you literally just break down different portions of it, I think they would understand a little bit more. If you were like, okay, North Africa is this, this is why, this is why, this is blah blah blah, then that's why next to them there's Africans who are Muslim. Does that make, you know what I mean? It starts making sense when you really break it down like that. And
Yeah.
even with Asia, you know, people are like, oh, Southeast Asian. I'm like, okay, so like South Asian, Indian people, Sri Lankan, Pakistan. Then there's East Asian, Chinese, Japanese. And then I have to tell them, like, you know, but mix it together. We're like a little bit more brown. We have a little bit of like, you know, other things going on that are similar to that. Like we have like some curry stuff, we have some Indonesian stuff, like, you know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
contextualizing it, and it sounds so silly to boil it down like that, but I'm like, oh my God, it makes so much more sense than just saying like the 9/11 thing. Oh, they're just jealous of our freedom, and we don't even know what Saudi Arabia is. We don't even, like, ask anybody who's like, who are we at war with, Iraq or Iran? And what's the difference between both of them? They have fucking no clue, you know? And it's like they're completely different. So I feel like, you know, like having these personal things, and also just going and being interested in actually when you're learning about these things and people, because I feel like you kind of have to see it like that. And we're so like we're so like morally bankrupt, you know what I mean? We're so culturally bankrupt, and it's really kind of disturbing. So that's why I kind of like even just reading over, because like Jay did a bunch of really lovely research, so that I could kind of like know it, because I mean honestly it's very impressive, like all the things I'm like, oh, you know, a little bit Arabic for sure, like of course, why wouldn't you, you know, like but just like it's great to connect with people who kind of understand, and it makes me feel like, okay, like there are ways that we can definitely like make other people understand too, because I know it's not always people just trying to be ignorant. It's just very hard if it's not given to you at a young age, because like when 9/11 happened, I was so young. There was no way that we were going to be like, all right, we're talking about Palestine and Israel. Thankfully, my dad did talk to me about that when I was young, so it wasn't a new thing for me when I got older. But there was still so much for me to learn. And even now, researching certain things, I get caught in this like just holes of stuff, especially because we are a young country. America, the United States is such a young country. And I didn't understand until I started trying to research Vietnam. And I was like, all right, I'm like 3,000 years back and I'm still very confused. Like, so I just like want to thank you also for like the work that you do, because I see that you like lead so many different organizations, as well as like being published and talking about all this stuff. And I don't know, it makes me feel really, really hopeful and happy and honestly in awe of you a little bit. Like I know that Jay has talked about you so highly, so I definitely didn't expect anything less, but I'm still very just in awe. But
it's so mutual. It's so deeply mutual. I'm perpetually like inspired, pleased, motivated by the work that you all are doing, and the amount of like critique and emphasis on like life affirming anything in the world. And I honestly I take it with me everywhere I go. I mean, sincerely. So thank you all for what you do. Thank you for your emphasis on context. Also, I just wanted to throw that out there. I think that's so important. And whenever possible, I tell people this all the time. Like somebody will ask me, how do like Arabs feel about this? And I'm like, there are like 21 countries in the Arab world. You know,
yeah, and they all are different from each other. Like I'm like, if you ask like an Egyptian person about Lebanese stuff, you're gonna get a very different answer than like what you think you're gonna get. You know
yeah,
what I mean? And then also when people are like, oh, Muslim people, or like see, like it's just so for lack of a better word, stupid sometimes. Like I really hate to say it, but sometimes it's like people don't understand. I don't know. It's just context. It's really context. And once you learn the context behind it, like even like okay, so Shakira, I love Shakira, right? So she's Lebanese, but she grew up in Colombia, and people are like so fucked up about that. And I'm like, actually, a lot of Lebanese people are in Colombia because of da 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 da. And like Selma Hayek, I'm pretty sure she's actually Arab. You know what I mean, or something. She has like that something definitely in her background, but she
yeah.
like grew up somewhere else. So I think people think it's like strange because they're not up to par. And like I said, there's so much history that you can't know every single thing. But just knowing you don't know every single thing, being open to learning and being curious, even because even through food, you can figure out a
Word.
lot.
Say that.
You can figure out a lot. Like, okay, we have banh mi, so we have baguettes. Where do you think we got that from? You know what I mean? Like, we have borrowed words. We say cafe. Like, why is my grandmother saying carrot? Like, that's weird, But
Yeah.
there it is,
Yeah.
So, there's so much that, yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but it's just like I'm looking and it's just like so many things that I would love to just expand even more and more. Because I'm just really impressed. Honestly, both you and Jay are super impressive, and I just love like more than impressive. You both are very compassionate and intelligent, and like apply that in such a way that really matters, because there's so many intelligent people that I know that are actually really kind of stupid. You know what I mean? Like I'm just like that doesn't because there's no heart there, So I really love that there is like your heart is present, and I'm just like I don't know, like I know it's me and Jay do this all the time. We just circle jerk constantly about like how happy we are to like be doing this work and feeling like fulfilled and stuff. But like you can be in our circle if you want. No worries if not. But what are you like looking forward to as far as the next few months even?
I think so. I turn 23 next week.
Oh my gosh, happy birthday.
Turn up. Thank you.
Capricorns rule the world. That's why this list is so impressive, I'm pretty
Period.
sure.
Period. I'm so like I'm excited to get older. I'm excited to know more people and to grow a little bit more contextualized. I think what you said earlier was beautiful. I think culture facilitates movement. Yeah, culture gives us the context to know what we have to move toward, and I'm excited in the next few months because I am feeling very centered. I've been on a sabbatical right now to process what these last 4 years have been, and I'm now like getting back into, like working and this and that and whatever. But I'm excited to reset my intentions for the top of the year, post sabbatical. I'm really excited to sit down and itemize that and then to create it, to actually do it. And so far, that's been something I've been very thankful to be able to do. But I just want to do it again. And I think that's also like, I hope I feel this way every year, right? I hope I feel this way. I want to feel every year as if I have like beat my expectations for what life can feel like, what the human experience can feel like, and then reset them and do it again until I die. And so I'm excited to do that next week. And that's one of the things that makes me excited about my birthday being at the end of the year. So that's what I'm looking forward to.